You know what's fun? Staying indoors, playing video games, and having nothing more to worry about than a paper cut. Yeah, don't worry about going outside. Why risk your life for a breath of fresh air when you can have air that smells like, well, you? There's scary things just outside your door. Animals that want to eat you, people that also want to eat you, and spirits that I'm pretty sure want to eat you too. So today I've got some allegedly true scary outdoor stories. Better log into Monster Hunter World. It's gonna be a long night. If you have a scary story of your own, share it with us at darkstories.org. Now, let's begin. Cabin in the Woods from XXrowwddyyXX. This happened in Cincinnati, Ohio, specifically Claremont County. I'm a 31-year-old woman, and this happened in 2006. At the time, I must have been 17, going on 18. My boyfriend Mike, my friend Amy, and her boyfriend Nick are the ones involved in this unexplained event, including myself, of course. Now, there's this abandoned cabin in the middle of the woods. You can only get to it by walking about a mile in one direction. There are abandoned cars, an ambulance, some tractors, and other random vehicles like short school buses and such, just sitting there, and many of them are covered in bullet holes. There's not even a path to drive a vehicle back there. Believe me, if there was, we wouldn't be walking a mile to get there. So we're not entirely sure how those abandoned vehicles and things got out there. My boyfriend and I had gone with 2 other friends previous to our encounter. It was creepy, but nothing compared to what happened when we went with Amy and Nick. On our previous trip, we went with our friends T and J, playing a failed session of a Ouija board. Later on after this, my boyfriend and I were talking to Amy and Nick about the cabin, about what we saw when T and J came with us. So we decided we were going to go later that day together. The day this encounter happened, the 4 of us went to the lake, packed a cooler with food, and spent probably 5 hours or so just hanging out at the lake. Once we left, we stopped at Amy and Nick's house, dropping the cooler off, which was in the trunk of the car. After getting everything out of the trunk from our lake trip, we headed to my boyfriend's parents' house, where we parked the car and began our hour walk to the weird cabin. We had flashlights, and that was pretty much it. The walk there was uneventful, which I'm now thankful for. We made our way through the 2 huge drainage tunnels before we made it to the cabin. It wasn't dark out just yet. That night when we saw the cabin again, something seemed different about it. It's hard to explain, but it was just different. Maybe it's because we came later last time, but I don't think that was it. When we get inside, Amy and I were going to go upstairs. I wanted to show her the weird socks in the wall, and I also wanted to check on that clock I broke last visit that I'd somehow heard ticking again when we were outside. As we start to go up the stairs, there's a sudden and loud crash, like something was thrown or knocked over. Amy freaks out, and then out of nowhere, she books it back outside and heads down to the creek, yelling at Mike, Nick, and myself to follow her. I go chasing after her, and she's in tears, having a full-blown panic attack. She was saying something, but I couldn't understand it. Finally, I can make out what she's saying as she calms down. She said she saw someone in the window looking at us, someone she didn't recognize. We tell the guys about this, and they look around for a while. But in the end, we seem to be alone. Nobody's here. Nobody's been here but us. Since she's feeling so upset, we decide to leave. As we're walking back down through the creek bed, heading back the same way we came, Mike and Nick are kicking over these huge rocks. We stop and realize that there are huge rocks or boulders standing right up in a line the entire way down the creek bed. They were not like this before. They couldn't have been set up like this anyway, as we just crossed through here a few minutes ago. And these are huge rocks. It'd take multiple people to even roll them or tip them over, let alone line them up. We were beginning to freak out, all of us. We picked up the pace and started to haul tail out of there. We make it to the first drainage tunnel, and we turn on our flashlights. Well, we tried to, but all 4 of our flashlights stopped working. None of them would turn on. They'd been working perfectly fine on the way there. So what was going on? Half an hour later, we make it back to my boyfriend's parents' house, where Amy and Nick's car is parked. Amy gets in her car because at this point she's ready to go home, ready to forget this event even happened. The rest of us are still outside the car. Then Amy suddenly gets out of the car screaming, jumping up and down and flailing about. She's covered in ants. We scramble over to her and look inside the car. They're coming from the back seat, from the trunk. Nick opens the trunk of the car, and lying in the trunk is this huge, rusty, extremely old wool sock, and it's covered in ants. Now remember what I said earlier. We'd been in and out of that trunk all day, storing and removing things, and there was nothing in that trunk when we left the house from dropping off the cooler. Now there was this freaking disgusting wool sock covered in ants. There were so many they were draped over the car inside and out. Needless to say, we've never headed back to that cabin, and I personally will never go back there. I would later learn that a man used to live at that cabin named Hubert, a man who had lusted for children. Think of all of this what you will, but I'll always remember the terror and confusion I felt that night. Camper Creature from Jacob R. My family and I go camping every year for Halloween, and every time we go to the same campground. This happened a few years ago in 2016. We had a brand new reflection camper that we'd gotten shortly after my 16th birthday. It was October 30th. We'd just gotten our designated camper lot and got set up. It was around 2 p.m. My parents decided to go get some food for the weekend and candy for the trick-or-treaters for tomorrow night. While they were gone, I took the time to go and ride my bike around the campground, maybe go do a little bit of fishing too. I was gone for maybe 30 minutes or so when I came back to the camper. Something seemed different. Something seemed wrong. When I left, the outdoors had been quite loud, but now it was eerily silent. The birds stopped chirping, and the wind slowed to a crawl. Even all the people that were outside before had all gone back into their campers. As I walked to the camper door, a bit confused, the entire camper began to shake violently. I could hear things getting thrown and broken inside. The next thing I hear, there's glass breaking and something falling out of the back of the camper. I quickly run around to the back, only to see the hind end of a pale grayish creature running into the woods on all fours. I saw just enough of its body, and it was horrifying. I think it even had some sort of horns or antlers. It was really skinny, so much so you could see the bones under its skin. Just before breaking into the tree line, it let out this shrill scream. My hands jumped to cover my ears, and I cringed. Soon, it was gone. I looked at the camper, and there were deep, long gashes in the metal sheeting of the camper, broken glass all over the ground. I went inside, and everything was destroyed. Little to say, we didn't stay there for the rest of the week. My completely outraged parents took the camper back to the dealership for repairs. Luckily, they didn't blame me, as the markings and damage done looked to be done by an animal. They thought it was a bear who had wandered in to get some food. At the worst, they blamed me for leaving the door open or something. But I know I didn't. Sure, it was an animal that got in. They're right about that. But it was an animal that could open doors like a person. Ugh, that thing's scream will haunt me till the day I die. Creature in the Adirondacks, from Averopsis. I bought this cabin last year, right before the company I worked for went belly up, and I lost basically everything else. It was meant to be a fishing cabin, but losing my job forced me to leave the apartment in New York City that I could no longer afford, and the cabin became my new home. I took up some freelance writing to keep myself fed, and I fixed up the old Land Rover that the previous owners had left on the property for grocery runs. The cabin itself came fully furnished, with brand new appliances. It was lakefront property, a rarity in the Adirondack Park due to strict building requirements. It had a 3-bedroom main floor and a basement accessible from outside of the house that doubled as a garage for the Land Rover and a laundry room. Following the advice of one of the locals, I bought a large freezer to store meat and vegetables through the winter. Roads leading into the remote town of Long Lake were treacherous during the winter months, and that made food scarce and expensive. I loved summer nights in the cabin. I'd relax by the water with a bottle of Merlot and a good buck, watching the sun set behind the mountains. Unlike the Big Apple, there were no street lights, screens, or billboards. The view of the Milky Way was the best I'd ever seen. Huge herds of deer would occasionally pass through, and I felt so much more in tune with myself than I ever did back in the city. I did notice some strange things happening. One morning I went for a walk just before sunrise and found a deer carcass completely torn apart. It was clear that whatever had killed the poor thing had no intentions of eating it. Its head was tossed about 50 feet away from the body, its glassy eyes staring at its entrails, strewn across the lower tree branches. Blood coated the leaves and tree trunks, and crows had already begun picking at it. After retching and heaving for several minutes, I called the park rangers out here to take a look. "Think it was a mountain lion?" I asked. I did hear that the Parks Department released some to control the deer population. "Not likely," the ranger responded. "That's just a myth. We'll look into it and see if we can't track down what caused it." That was their canned response each time it happened, because it did happen again and again. Every other week it seems like I found a new deer corpse decorating my property, inching closer and closer to my cabin each time. It seemed as though something was circling me, dominating this area, marking its territory. The deer carcasses weren't the only awful problems I encountered. Some nights, right before I drift off to sleep, I'd hear a sharp tapping on the front door. It was always several light taps on the door in quick succession. I'd get up to look out the peephole. I lived 20 minutes out of town on a poorly maintained dirt road, so it would have been odd to have a visitor so late at night. Right before I could look outside, the tapping would move again, often to my bedroom wall. Then it would move yet again. I could never pinpoint the source of the tapping, as it would move too quickly. I thought it was unlikely that a flock of woodpeckers would descend on my house this late at night just to bother me, but who knows what it really was. On those nights, I often sat in the living room with my shotgun until the noises stopped. One night, I decided to stay up and see if I could catch whatever was terrorizing me in action. I grabbed my gun, turned out all the lights. Then I sat in front of the living room window, looking out on my land. Save for the garage light illuminating a small spot, it was totally dark outside. The first hour passed by quietly, watching the moths desperately flutter around the only light. I could hear the dock bobbing in the water, rattling as it occasionally caught wake, but there were no crickets chirping or frogs singing. Right as I was about to head to bed, I saw something huge moving at the edge of the property. I sat bolt upright in my chair, clinging to my gun and waiting to see what it would do next. God, I wish I'd gone to bed. Wish I'd packed my bags the next day. There was a sudden spray of crimson. Another mutilated carcass, a rabbit this time, was thrown against the living room window, and a blood-curdling shriek tore through the night as yet another desecrated rodent bounced off the window's glass. Though my hands were shaking violently, I pulled a single round from my pocket and loaded the gun. My assailant had not shown itself yet. I headed for the front door to take a shot at it, wherever I thought it was, because at least I might spook it. As I opened the door, the culprit stepped into the light, and my heart sank. Nothing about it was right. It was impossibly thin and partially decomposed. Rotting hide peeled away to expose patches of bleached bone. It stood 7 feet tall, with wide-set yellow eyes and a skeletal face. It had jagged teeth and claws like knives, making it clear that though it resembled a deer, it was not one. I didn't dare waste a second on thinking. Right away, I lifted the bump stock to my shoulder and fired. It missed, but the creature backed away and made that ear-piercing shriek again. I heard it growl, making a sound like an out-of-tune radio station frequency. Then it vanished into the night. Good, I thought, locking every door and window behind me on the way back to bed. Now, it knows I'll defend myself. The game warden was at my door the next day, angrily demanding to know why my property was decorated with the corpses of deer and rodents. I was still blinking sleep from my eyes, and I indicated to him that I had no idea what it was he was talking about. From what I remembered from the night before, that thing had only thrown rodents at me. But as I looked around at my property, I caught sight of at least 10 deer strewn about like the first one I'd seen. It was all I could do not to vomit on the warden's boots. Eventually, he believed me when I told him I didn't do it. I told him about the creature I saw, saying it was likely a deer, but wrong. He dismissed that quickly, of course. He asked if I'd been getting enough sleep lately, then went on his way after assuring me that no such animal could exist. Definitely not in the Adirondacks. That night, I was cleaning my dishes for the evening when I heard the all-too-familiar tapping on the living room window. I quickly looked up to see the creature again, standing right in front of the window pane, staring me down with glowing yellow eyes. It raised a clawed hand and dragged his fingers down the glass, making a sharp screeching sound. I could see its heavy breathing condensed on the window in front of it. I scrambled for my shotgun, my machete, anything to protect myself, and then I realized I'd left the kitchen window open. Sobbing, I ducked into my bedroom and locked the door, before there was a loud crash as the beast ripped the window open. I moved my dresser in front of the door to form a barricade, a feeble attempt to save myself or prolong my suffering. I could hear its heavy breathing on the other side of the door, hear its low warbling growl, smell the stench of its rotting flesh. It rattled the doorknob, howled, and then left through the window. It took me several hours before I could bring myself to move. The creature had come close to killing me, and it simply stopped. I couldn't fathom why. Rather than wasting time on the details, I called a contractor to replace the window as quickly as possible. I offered a few hundred extra if they could fix it within the day, and I'd never seen a crew work quicker. That was 2 weeks ago. I saw it again earlier today. I caught a glimpse of it standing at the edge of my property just after sundown. I'm afraid soon one of us is going to end this. I went down a haunted road that I shouldn't have. From Rooster. This happened to me and a friend of mine named Anne. In 2017, I was an airborne school graduate. I had, however, broken my leg in the first week. After graduation, I was set up to go down the road to 75th RTB to start Ranger Assessment and Selection Program. But I could hardly walk the day after graduation, so I went to the Troop Medical Center, where they gave me a 5-month profile to heal and left me stuck as a holdover. During the depressing time, I met a girl named Anne. She and I hit it off phenomenally. I spent almost every weekend in her apartment located in Auburn, Alabama. Now, I've visited many supposedly haunted places, and I've got a couple of stories about them. If there's an odd event, I like to do everything I can to explain it rationally first. I'll only consider it paranormal after exhausting every idea of what else it could be. I had told Anne a few of my stories, making her watch some movies that she'd never seen. Anne had grown up Pentecostal, so she was never allowed to watch non-Christian shows, movies, and she couldn't listen to anything but country or Christian. She knew I loved to visit rumored haunted locations, so she told me about her own experience on Smedley Road. The story of Smedley Road sounded like a very typical small-town ghost story. Rumors of witches living in the woods, among other things. There's also a story of a family who died in the late 1800s from tuberculosis or some other rampant disease. The whole family had perished and were said to be buried in a small cemetery down the lonely, seldom-used road. Each member was laid to rest in this cemetery except for one. A man and his wife with their son had been buried together, but some tragic mistake had left their young daughter to be buried elsewhere. The story goes that if you can find this cemetery on a long, narrow, overgrown and unmarked road, and you park your vehicle and turn it off, the family of the lost child will return to search for her and will not let you go before they have finished the search. Then you should be able to start your car and leave. Of course, this piqued my interest. I've never experienced such a phenomenon. Now, this was the story that Anne told me. I texted her to have her tell me again so I could be more accurate. Here's her story from her point of view. When we were in high school, my cousin Janet and I wanted to go down this haunted road, so we called up some friends, Jack, Trin, and Steve, to see if they wanted to take us. We knew that Jack knew the way. They agreed, bringing Janet and her boyfriend Fred. We met and left from Jack's house in Jack's old single-cab Ford truck. Jack, Trin, and Steve were in the front seats of the truck, while me, Janet, and Fred were in the bed. When we started down the actual road, I kept seeing red lights following us through the trees. All of a sudden, Fred yelled out, "What the hell?" And we both looked to the other side where he was. There they were, matching our speed deep in the woods, more red lights. After they disappeared behind a group of trees, we didn't see them again. It was then that we pulled up to the cemetery and got out. We walked around a bit, but got a really bad, creepy feeling, so we began to leave. Once we loaded back into the truck, the dang thing wouldn't start. Jack kept trying and trying the engine, but it wasn't turning over. After what seemed like an hour, but was only maybe 5 minutes, the truck roared back to life and we pulled out of there so fast, I thought we were going to lose the tires. That was Anne's story. After hearing that, how could I resist going there myself? After much persuasion, she agreed to show me the way. The following day, we left at about 1 p.m. I wanted to get a good idea of the route and see it in the day. The road was indeed hard to find, and the cemetery was small and full of old beer cans from, I'm guessing, the 70s. Those beefy pull-tab cans. There were 2 sections, one lower than the other towards the back wood line. As soon as I walked down and stepped foot on the lower plane, a feeling of dread swept over me. All these graves here had been desecrated. brass nameplates ripped from tombstones, and the others pushed over or broken. There were graves that looked like they had been dug out, too. Before you say that the casket may have collapsed and that caused it, that's not what these were. In fact, in some of these holes that were dug out at the graves, the casket was completely removed. The partially filled-in holes now full of weeds and overgrown grass. Anne was waiting in the car. She refused to step foot into that cemetery. I figured that the place was like many others and rumors were just rumors. I doubted that anything paranormal would happen. Maybe Jack and Steve had messed with the whole group years ago. But I would soon be proved wrong about this theory. We would later come back at around 3 a.m. The road was pitch black then. Even the LED lights I'd recently installed in her car on bright could only cut about 10 feet into the darkness. The road was full of sharp and sudden turns, so I had to go extra slow. It was creepy. Nothing looked the same in the dark as it did in the day. We would have driven past it if Anne didn't jerk up and grab my arm to tell me to stop. She had gotten a bad feeling in her gut when we were near, and sure enough, we stopped at the right location, based entirely on her gut instinct. We got out and used our phone's flashlights to look around. The air felt noticeably cooler here. Before we even drove over, it was a hot and humid Alabama night, but it was completely different here. I lit a cigarette and started to walk when Anne called me back and asked for one herself. Anne had never smoked before, and she took it with shaking hands leaning out the window. I lit the cigarette hesitantly. She was trembling so bad, but I felt fine at the time. I didn't have any dreadful feelings yet. I walked around a bit at the upper part, still no indication of anything even slightly paranormal. I walked towards the back and walked down the slope. Almost immediately, an overwhelming tidal wave of dread hit me. I felt as if I was being watched, like someone was shooting daggers into my back, like I was being stalked by a mountain lion. It was an uncomfortable feeling, immersed in more uncomfortable silence. There were no animals or insects making noise anymore. It was deafening in its silence, and I was trying my best to remain calm, while every instinct in me was telling me to run. Then I heard the snapping of twigs nearby and the crunching of leaves. I was thinking it was a deer, but I couldn't see it. It sounded like it was only a few feet in front of me in the woods. I shined my light around, and I spotted a weird shadow. It was almost like someone peeking out from behind a large tree trunk. I could make out half a head, half a torso, a shoulder, and an arm. Maybe it was just my light casting a weird shadow from some leaves or a bush or something, I told myself. It was then that Anne yelled at me, saying it was time to leave. I could hear the terror and urgency in her voice. I took one last look at this shadow, saw it dart behind the tree line. I wasn't moving the light at all when that happened. I got the heck out of Dodge and took off sprinting, scrambling, tripping, all the briar and dewberry catching my pant legs as I ran blindly back towards Anne. When I fell into one of those dugout graves, I nearly broke my ankle. I picked myself up and got up the hill. This time the bad feeling did not leave me as it had earlier. I jammed the keys in the ignition and I tried to start it. But just like in Anne's story, it only clicked. It was like the battery had decided to die right then and there. I assumed in my panic that Anne had simply left the interior lights on, causing the battery to go dead. I was about to open the door to go check the battery connection when Anne grabbed the key, turned it, and it started right up. In that moment, her face was lit by moonlight, and I could make out tears streaming down her face. I squeezed her hand tightly and tried to reassure her. I put it in drive and turned left as sharp as I could. I had to do a 3-point turnaround because of how narrow the road was. When I put it in reverse and backed up to the edge of the cemetery, I could see it in the red hue of the taillights. A pitch-black torso and head inches from the car. But it didn't have any features to it. It was featureless and solid black, despite being lit point blank. I went from 0 to 60 in seconds, driving dangerously fast with very poor visibility. Every so often, I could see him in the woods on the edge of the road between trees or random patches of tall grass, and especially so when I would slow for a sharp turn. He would be illuminated again in our taillights a few feet behind us in the middle of the road. Anne didn't see him, because she had her face buried in my arms sobbing. She then jerked up and asked me a question that I wished she hadn't. "Do you hear that?" I shook my head. I truly didn't hear anything but rocks crunching under the tires and my own heart beating. She physically pulled me over into her lap, causing me to hit the brakes. She pulled my head almost out the window when I finally heard it, the sound of a woman wailing and screaming deep into the woods. My eyes lit up with fear, and I asked her what the heck that was. I quickly got seated again, and I could now hear it from my side of the car. I pushed the pedal as far as it would go to the floor. Periodically, I would see the shadowy man. I could constantly hear the screaming even miles down the road. As soon as the car touched the dirt road that adjoined Smedley and led to Hardball, everything just stopped. The screaming, the shadow, the horrible feeling and terror. We drove back to her apartment in silence that was only broken by muffled sobs coming from my tear-soaked arm. Later, we talked about what happened, and she told me that when I was down by the back of the cemetery, she couldn't see me or my light, but she could hear tapping on the rear window glass like a cold and bony finger. The tapping moved to the back driver's side door and then to my door, like someone was tapping the car as they walked around it. That's why she was yelling at me to come back. It didn't stop until I got up the slope and almost to the car. That night, she shook me awake because she had a nightmare about a large, menacing shadow man walking up behind me in the woods. I told her about the stalking shadow man that I saw that night. I hadn't told her about him because I didn't want to freak her out more. I guess he basically told her for me. I'll never go to Smedley Road again. I know that shadow man has not forgotten me. He reminds me of his existence in these occasional terrifying dreams I have of him stalking Anne. I think he let us leave that road once, but I don't think he'd let us leave a second time. The next time your mom tells you you have to go outside because you've been inside all day, tell her she's an old washed-up hag that needs to get good at Fortnite. Don't actually do that because she's probably super nice, super beautiful, and great at Fortnite, and you'd probably lose your life. The outdoors are dangerous for more reasons than you think. Seen or unseen, the dangers outside are very, very real. Good night. If you enjoyed this episode, be sure to like, share, comment, and subscribe. If you have some stories of your own, share them with us at darkstories.org, where they have a chance to be narrated by me, and they'll be read by hundreds of others. If you want to support the show, check the links below. There's a link to my Patreon where you can donate, and a link to my merch store where you can purchase some creepy cool clothes. Now, as usual, here are my 5 favorite early comments from the previous episode about 5 scary hunting stories. Alan Stewart says, "Funny that this came out the day before I go hunting." And those were the last words of Alan Stewart. Robert Bruce says, "Glad I've never seen anything weird hunting. Probably die of a heart attack." Well, don't speak too soon. I bet you on your next hunt, you see the weirdest thing of your life. Even if it's just an old crusty anime body pillow. There's a lot of those in the woods around here. Ronald C. says, I'm going hunting this weekend vegan style. Uh-oh, watch out, Zucchini. You're about to get squashed. Septic Raven says, I always have my Alexa play your podcasts when I go to sleep. My pets probably know your voice better than mine. Maybe I should tell some scary pet stories from their point of view. And when I finally tore open the treat bag when I wasn't supposed to, it was empty. And just some skinwalker with internet access says, I love it when hunters don't realize I'm hunting them. Question, what does human meat taste like? And would you recommend it? Well, that brings us to the end of this Darkness Prevails episode. But don't you worry, because more scary stories are on the way soon. Until next time, here are the credits to my amazing patrons who continue to donate. They're great people. Remember, stay safe out there and stay creepy, because this world is a strange one.